Morning, legends. Saturday morning, 40 k's on the bike, 3 times 15 minutes up the hill, 280 watts, nice and chill, not a crazy day. But whilst I was doing that longish ride, I was listening to this really interesting podcast that put into words what I have been thinking about for a while and not being able to actually explain about VO2 Max and its relevance to races. And that's what we're going to talk about today after I finish work at about 11:30 a.m. 11:30 a.m. Let's do it. Let's get to work. Okay, here is the podcast. The Norwegian Method podcast, season 3, episode 3, with Olav Alexander Boo. He is or was the coach of Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden, the Norwegian freaks, okay? The premise behind what they're talking about in this video is that you have to willingly sacrifice VO2 max to achieve the fastest critical velocities and things like that for longer distances over 4, 5, 6, 7 hours. Essentially, you have to get slower on the top end to get faster on the low end. Let's break this down because it's absolutely fascinating to me. Like, it's such a weird concept to think about. You gotta go slower at the fast stuff to go faster at the slow stuff. It's weird. Now, there is actually something that's guaranteed to make you faster without even thinking about training and critical velocities and stuff like that, and that is a good running hat. Welcome 10 at checkout. Link is in the description. Link is in the description. Okay, so first of all, what is a critical velocity? Let's say, for example, that you can run 60 kilometers in 1 hour. Okay, you're some Captain America type dude. Then your critical velocity for 1 hour would be 60 k's per hour. That would be your speed. Now, you can actually derive a lot of information from a lot of cycling related things by looking at their critical power, okay? The only thing that's equitable across those two is power for cycling and speed for running, because you can get pretty good at understanding how fast you're running at certain, kilometers per hour. Like, for example, my half marathon, I ran at 16 kilometers per hour. So that would be my 1 hour and 20 minute critical velocity, okay? Now, something interesting happens when you plot all of these different critical velocities onto a graph. Jeez, I almost need a new board because this one's getting a bit fucked up. So we're going to use myself for example. So if I've ran a 1 hour and 20 minute half marathon, let's just plug that in first. That's going to go right there. And then I'm going to put in my 10K time and my 5K time. For a bit of fun, I'm going to put in the fastest kilometer that I've ever done, which is like a 250, okay? And that is going to be around 20 kilometers-ish per hour. That is Eliud Kipchoge world record marathon pace for 1 kilometer. That's essentially my 2-minute 50-second critical velocity. And so what you can start to see here is that there is a curve developing where as we're moving further and further into our efforts in terms of critical velocity, our speed is slowing down, and we can call this our power curve, or at least that's what Olav Alexander Boo calls it. He calls it a power curve. Now, these power curves are essentially your fitness put in a really interesting way. This encompasses every energy system, including anaerobic, VO2 max, lactate, aerobic capacity. It all is shown in one graph to see what's actually going on. And if I were to have as much data as Olav, you would pretty confidently be able to find the ratios or the ideal ratios between these different critical velocities to understand where people are weak at. But from what he was saying in the podcast, there are generally 2 different patterns of this critical velocity curve that you're looking for. So the first one is the flat power curve. Essentially, you have no top end speed speed, or at least you're detrained in that top end of your running, and you've been spending a lot of time in that aerobic capacity building phase, okay, what tends to happen is that the aerobic stuff comes up and the VO2 max stuff comes down. We're going to explain why in a second. But the second type of curve that you can generally see is a really steep curve, okay? All of the top end VO2 max aerobic stuff are really, really well trained with minimal actual critical velocities at longer sustained efforts over a couple of hours, okay? These are two very different athletes. Now here's where this kind of gets a little interesting, okay? Because Olav talks about how he willingly lets his athletes reduce their VO2 max over time, depending on their goals, okay? Because you cannot sustain a really high VO2 max if you're doing longer specific work for things like Ironman or longer marathon-y kind of stuff. It's really, really hard to maintain it. And it's also not advantageous to actually do that. The reasoning being is that you can only have so much volume and intensity in 1 week to actually recover from, okay? And to boost your VO2 max, you have to do very hard workouts, and you cannot do very hard workouts and reap the benefits from those whilst also doing enough aerobic base work to also raise this lower end of your critical velocity curve. You can't do both at the same time. What tends to happen is that people have to drop the overall aerobic volume to actually improve their VO2 max so they can do the VO2 max workouts to actually get the VO2 max gains, which is perfectly fine if that is the goal of your racing. You know, if you're trying to do shorter races that require more or a higher VO2 max, then that is perfect. But if you're trying to boost your VO2 max doing longer races, it's only going to be a detriment to your actual race. Here's an interesting little fact, okay? Christian Blumenfeld has supposedly had the highest recorded VO2 max test of all time, in like the hundreds or something, okay? But for the training for his Ironman specific work, he has to drop his VO2 max down to around 80 to be able to actually get enough volume in and actually recover from that stuff to be fast over the Ironman distance. You see, what tends to happen is if you train a lot of the low end, you can get closer to this VO2 max because you're lifting that bottom end of the curve, but it results in your curve becoming flatter. So sometimes flatter can be really good. Now, the question that I have is, how does this correlate to actual running distances, okay? Now, in this podcast itself, Olav talks about how VO2 max is still critically important up to the Olympic triathlon distance. Now, I looked into the Olympic triathlon distance because I've only ever watched maybe 2 or 3 of them, okay? The world record is 1 hour and 45 minutes, okay? So the critical velocity in that, or the critical intensity, is a 1 hour 45 to 2 hour effort. So anything shorter than that critical velocity of 1 hour and 45 at max pace is going to be highly determinant on your VO2 max. Anything longer than that is probably not. The determinant for performances 2 hours and longer is probably going to be more around the threshold band of this power curve and the lower aerobic, okay? Shorter distances, big spiky power curve. Longer distances than 2 hours, flat power curve is the way to go, okay? Now, all this stuff is really interesting, but I actually think that there is a third approach, a more long-term approach that sometimes you need to do. Maybe when you're a beginner runner, fridge, be quiet, thank you. Maybe when you're a beginner runner or someone who just needs to overall, you know, get back into training or improve their fitness, okay? This is the third one. Now, this is a more balanced power curve where there are no outliers, there are no weaknesses. It's just essentially from your training, you're creating a balanced curve where you don't have too much low aerobic, you know, capacity. You don't have too much VO2 max. This is like a good middle ground where you're essentially in a position where you can kind of just go and do anything at all. And I find this to be the best kind of approach. But let's break down what each of these different graphs should be. So this flat graph is going to be for efforts that are longer than 2 hours, okay? And you should really focus on thresholdy stuff, high aerobic, low aerobic, for events that are gonna require you to be moving for 2+ hours, okay? For most people, that is actually for everyone on the world except one person ever, that is going to be marathon effort, and probably half marathon too for quite a lot of people as well. That 2 hour effort is super important. The next one is more of a specific phase. So yeah, we're probably steepening the curve and biasing towards one particular thing, whether it's 10K effort, 5K effort, mile, 3K, probably half marathon for some people who are quite fast, okay? We're going to be steepening the curve. So your critical velocities at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours are going to be impacted by training in this way to increase that power curve, okay? This is gonna require you to do VO2 Max workouts quite regularly, threshold workouts quite regularly. You don't have to do as much volume to get the same benefits out of this specific phase. And realistically, in a long-term approach, we need both of them. We need to go from flat curves to steep curves and back, because that's how you slowly progress over time and you develop as a runner. Now, the last one is the balanced curve, okay? This is training to improve overall fitness. So you're not gonna be able to peak your fitness out in some sort of aspect. What you're doing is you're finding a middle ground. So maybe you're hitting VO2 Max once every 2 weeks. You're doing a threshold session once every 2 weeks. You're doing some steady running, you're doing some strides and some sprints, and you're doing a lot of aerobic running. That is going to produce a nice balanced curve. Perhaps that is perfect for people who are just getting into running, just to build themselves up. Or perhaps it's good off-season training where you're just trying to maintain everything. You're not the best at certain things, you're not the worst, you're just balanced across the board. Perhaps that's the best way to be for someone who doesn't even really care about maximizing performance. It's just, I just want to be nice and balanced, have fun in every single kind of race. So yeah, when people tell you in the future that VO2 Max is the only thing that really matters for determining your potential as a runner, just tell them that it's dumb.